What if I told you there was a man who gave up everything to live in total poverty, preach to birds, and tame a savage wolf, all in the name of Christ? Welcome to Daily Blessing, where we uncover the stories of saints who changed the world. Today, we meet Saint Francis of Assisi, the humble man who saw God in all creation, even the smallest creature. There are saints who suffered, saints who preached, saints who led great movements or built cathedrals in their names. But among them, one name echoes across centuries not for his power or miracles alone, but for the quiet gentleness of his soul, for the way he embraced poverty, loved animals, and saw the face of God in every flower, every bird, every person. His name was Francis of Assisi. But who was he really? To the world, he is the patron saint of animals, ecology, and peace. His image, a humble man in a brown robe, surrounded by birds and deer, decorates gardens, prayer cards, and churches across the globe. But this iconic figure was once a wealthy young man, obsessed with fashion, songs, and status. He threw lavish parties, dreamed of military glory, and lived for himself, until God called him, not with thunder, but with a whisper. Saint Francis's life is not just the story of a man who became holy. It's the story of a soul who fell in love, completely, irrevocably, with Christ. And like all great love stories, it cost him everything. In this journey, we will walk through the beautiful and sometimes painful path that led Francis from luxury to leprosy colonies, from war to wonder, from Assisi's shining streets to the foot of a wooden cross. We'll witness miracles, not flashy or loud, but tender moments of creation responding to a heart that loved without measure. We'll meet a man who didn't tame animals with power, but with peace, who didn't fear death, but welcomed it like a sister, and who left behind not wealth or fame, but a movement of simplicity and joy that still touches millions of hearts. So, take a deep breath. Let the world slow down for just a moment, and listen closely to this story, not just with your mind, but with your heart. Because in learning about Saint Francis, you might just hear God whispering to you too. Francis was born in the year 1181, or perhaps 1182, in the small Italian town of Assisi, nestled among the rolling hills of Umbria. His birth name was Giovanni di Pietro di Bernard I, but his father, a wealthy cloth merchant recently returned from France, affectionately called him Francesco, meaning the Frenchman. The name stuck, and so began the story of a boy who would one day become a saint. From the start, Francis lived a life many only dreamed of. His father dealt in expensive fabrics, silks, fine linens, bright dyes, selling to nobles and aristocrats. Their home was large, filled with music and laughter, warmed by servants and surrounded by the bustle of a prosperous life. Francis lacked nothing. He was bright, charming, and beloved by all. His mother, Pica, raised him with quiet tenderness and a sense of faith, though in those early years, his eyes were fixed more on the pleasures of the world than the presence of God. As a teenager, Francis was the center of every gathering. He loved poetry, music, fine clothes, and the thrill of a good story. He would throw parties in the town square, treating his friends generously. Many called him the king of youth, not for his power, but for the way he carried joy wherever he went. But beneath the laughter and charm was a heart that quietly yearned for something more. Though he didn't know it yet, the seeds of holiness had been planted. Even then, Francis couldn't walk past a beggar without feeling a twinge of guilt. He would sometimes give away his father's coins or garments in secret. There was compassion there, a flickering flame, not yet a fire. Like many young men of his time, Francis dreamed of glory in battle. He longed to become a knight, to wear armor, win honor, and make a name for himself. War, after all, was the stage on which legends were made. And in the year 1202, when war broke out between the rival cities of Assisi and Perugia, Francis seized his chance. He put on the armor his father bought him, mounted a horse, and rode into battle, believing it was the beginning of greatness. But what awaited him was not glory, but the first great unraveling of his comfortable life. Captured, imprisoned, and sick, Francis would soon discover that God had a very different kind of battle in mind for him. Not one of swords and kingdoms, but of surrender, silence, and service. The dream of knighthood would fade, but something far greater was beginning to stir in his soul. The battlefield was not what Francis imagined. There was no glory, no honor, no shining moment of triumph. Instead, the war between Assisi and Perugia quickly became a nightmare. The battle was short and devastating. Assisi's forces were overwhelmed. Francis, along with many others, was captured by the Perugians. But because he came from a wealthy family, he was not executed. He was held for ransom, thrown into a cold, disease-ridden prison. For nearly a year, Francis sat in a dark cell, sick, confused, and broken. He who had once walked through marble halls now sat on a dirt floor, hearing the groans of wounded men echoing in the night. The laughter of his youth was gone. The music of his parties replaced by silence and suffering. But it was in this silence that God began to speak. We don't know everything that passed through Francis's heart during that long imprisonment, but we know that when he finally returned to Assisi, weakened in body, worn in spirit, something inside him had changed. He no longer found joy in the things that once delighted him. The silk clothes, the attention, the parties, they now felt hollow, like echoes of a world that no longer satisfied his soul. Still, the call of the world wasn't so easily shaken. After he recovered, Francis once again pursued his dream of becoming a knight. This time, to join a campaign under Count Walter of Brienne, a military leader heading south to fight in Apulia. He dressed himself in the finest armor, prepared his horse, and rode out from Assisi, full of ambition once more. But just one day into the journey, something extraordinary happened. That night, as he slept, Francis had a dream, one that would change the course of his life forever. In the dream, he saw a grand palace filled with shining weapons, and he heard a voice asking, "Who do you prefer to serve, the master or the servant?" Francis answered, "The master." Then the voice said, "Why then do you seek to serve the servant? Return home, and there you will be shown what to do." When he awoke, the meaning was clear. The path of earthly glory was not for him. God was calling him to a different kind of knighthood, one not adorned in armor, but in humility. So Francis did something unthinkable. He turned around. He went back home, back to Assisi, not in shame, but in obedience to the divine whisper in his heart. His friends mocked him. His father was furious. Everyone called him a coward, a failure, a fool. But Francis no longer lived by the world's approval. Something deeper was stirring, a restlessness that wouldn't let him go, a question that haunted him. "Lord, what do you want me to do?" It was the beginning of his true conversion, the beginning of surrender. The battlefield had broken him open so that grace could enter. Francis returned to Assisi a different man, but he didn't yet know what he was becoming. He wandered the countryside in solitude, often avoiding the laughter of his former friends. He no longer found joy in their shallow entertainments. He would sit for hours in quiet chapels, staring at crucifixes. He began to pray not out of routine, but with tears, whispering, "Lord, what would you have me do?" The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was slow, hidden, like a seed germinating underground. But God was working, stripping away the layers of pride, ambition, and vanity that had once defined him. One day, while praying in the ruined chapel of San Damiano, just outside Assisi, something happened that would change Francis's life forever. As he knelt before the ancient crucifix, old, weather-worn, and faded, he suddenly heard a voice speak, clear and unmistakable. The voice of Christ from the cross. "Francis, go and rebuild my church, which as you see is falling into ruin." He froze. Was it his imagination? A hallucination? But no, he felt it deep in his soul. It wasn't a metaphor to him. The walls around him were literally crumbling. He took the words literally. Filled with purpose, he ran into town and sold bales of cloth from his father's shop to buy stones and materials for the chapel. He brought them to the priest of San Damiano, offering the money joyfully. But the priest refused it, uncertain about Francis's behavior and the source of the money. Word spread fast. The people of Assisi whispered, laughed, even pitied him. His father, Pietro, was humiliated. Furious, he dragged Francis before the local bishop, demanding that his son return the money and publicly disown any claim to the family wealth. In that moment, under the gaze of the town and the church, Francis did something astonishing. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He quietly removed his fine clothes, laying them at his father's feet. Then he spoke. "Until now, I have called Pietro Bernard one my father. But from now on, I say only, Our Father, who art in heaven. Naked, exposed, yet free, Francis walked away. The bishop wrapped him in a cloak, and Francis stepped into a new life, one not owned by gold, nor clothed in status. He belonged to no one but God. He began begging stones with his own hands and slowly restored San Damiano, stone by stone. Then he rebuilt other ruined chapels nearby. All the while, he slept under the stars, sang psalms to the birds, and lived by the charity of others. To the world, he looked like a madman, a fool in rags building crumbling churches. But heaven knew better. God was not just rebuilding chapels. He was rebuilding a soul, now truly free from wealth, family ties, and societal expectations. Francis became what few dare to become, a man with nothing but God. He wore a simple tunic, tied at the waist with a rope. He slept in fields, forests, or abandoned chapels. He begged for bread, and though he owned almost nothing, his heart was filled with a joy few ever know. This was not a man running from the world, but a man running towards something deeper, a life that mirrored Christ's own poverty. Francis believed that to be close to Jesus, one had to strip away not just possessions, but the desire to possess. Power, pride, security, these were to be surrendered. He called this path Lady Poverty, and he loved her like a bride. He found God not in cathedrals of marble, but in the broken, the forgotten, the dirty. He would embrace lepers, kiss their wounds, and sing hymns with them in the dust. It was with them, the most outcast of society, that Francis discovered the tenderness of Christ. He began preaching in the streets and fields. His words were not lofty sermons or theological treatises. They were simple, burning truths. God is love. God is near. Repent and rejoice. People listened, not because he was eloquent, but because he was real. He lived what he preached. He looked like Christ, and the poor recognized something divine in him. Soon, others were drawn to his way of life. Young men from noble families began leaving behind their money, their titles, their comforts, to follow this joyful beggar. They called themselves the Friars Minor, the Lesser Brothers, committed to living in humility, poverty, and peace. They owned nothing, walked barefoot, and wandered through towns singing, preaching, and serving. They worked with their hands, cared for the sick, and slept wherever they were received. Francis wrote a simple rule: live according to the gospel. Trust God. Give all. Take nothing. His joy was infectious. Even nature seemed to respond to his purity. Birds would land on his shoulders as he prayed. Lambs followed him. Flowers seemed to bloom wherever he walked. Yet, Francis never sought attention. He often ran from praise. He called himself the little poor man, and whenever people tried to exalt him, he would say, I am what I am before God, nothing more. For Francis, poverty was not a punishment, it was a gift. It was the door that let him walk unburdened into the arms of God. He had lost the world, but gained heaven, and soon, even the animals of the forest would recognize him as one of their own. Among the most powerful moments in Francis's transformation was the one that cost him most. Not money, not fame, but comfort. Because in the world of Francis, there was one group more feared, more avoided, more hated than any other: the lepers. Lepers were cast out from towns, forced to live in colonies on the outskirts of cities. Their bodies bore the wounds of disease. Their faces were disfigured. Their cries made people turn away in disgust. No one came near them, not friends, not family. To touch a leper was unthinkable. And for most of his life, Francis was no different. He, too, was afraid of them. He would turn his face away when he saw them on the road. He admits it himself in his testament, written near the end of his life. When I was in sin, the sight of lepers nauseated me beyond measure. But grace has a strange way of meeting us at the edge of our fears. One day, while riding through the countryside, Francis saw a leper walking toward him, covered in sores, his body broken. His heart trembled, and the old instinct to flee rose up. But something stopped him. The Spirit whispered, "If you cannot embrace what you fear, how can you say you love me?" Francis dismounted. He walked slowly to the man. His hands trembled. And then, with all the love he could gather, he embraced him. He pressed his lips to the leper's cheek and kissed him. In that moment, something broke open inside him. Years of pride, fear, and selfishness dissolved. He later wrote, "What had been bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body." Afterward, he began visiting the leper colonies regularly, not to pity them, but to serve them. He would wash their wounds, cook their meals, bandage their hands. He sat beside them, prayed with them, and called them brother. It was here, among the disfigured and forgotten, that Francis learned the real shape of love. Not words, not feelings, but presence. He saw the suffering Christ in each face, each broken hand, each pair of eyes longing not for healing, but for dignity. The leper did not need to be fixed. He needed to be seen. And Francis saw him. He once said, "The Lord led me among them, and I showed mercy to them. And what was once bitter became sweet." That kiss, that embrace, it was more than an act of kindness. It was the turning point. It was the moment when Francis of Assisi died and the saint was born. In the wounds of the leper, he found the wounds of Christ. And in loving what he once feared, he became free. As Francis journeyed through the hills and meadows of Umbria, his heart grew more and more attuned to the beauty of the world around him. He saw God's fingerprint in every stream, every tree, every animal. The wind whispered of the Spirit. The sun reminded him of Christ's warmth. The moon and stars, he called his sisters. All of creation, to Francis, was not background, but brotherhood. He believed that every living thing had a soul, a purpose, and a sacred role in the divine song of praise. Not just humans, not just saints, but birds, beasts, rocks, rivers. All creation was singing, and Francis longed to join the choir. One of the most famous stories from his life took place near the town of Bavagna. As Francis was walking with his companions, he noticed a great flock of birds gathering in the trees and fields around them. Sparrows, doves, crows, and swallows, all chirping and flapping, seemingly drawn to something unseen. Francis stopped in wonder. Then, with gentle reverence, he stepped toward the birds and began to speak. Not as a scientist, not as a poet, but as a brother. "My little sisters the birds," he said, "you owe much to God, your Creator. He has given you feathers for clothing, wings for flight, and the freedom of the skies. He cares for you, though you neither sow nor reap. Let your songs always praise Him." To the amazement of those watching, the birds did not fly away. In fact, they seemed to listen, quietly, intently, as if they understood every word. Some flew down and perched on his shoulders. Others circled above, calling out as if responding. Francis smiled and made the sign of the cross, blessing them. When he finished, he told them, "Now go and give praise to your Creator." And the birds took flight, filling the sky with song. It was a moment that became legendary, but to Francis, it was no miracle. It was natural. In his eyes, the animals had always been capable of knowing and loving their Creator. The only miracle was that someone finally stopped long enough to speak to them like family. From that day forward, Francis was known not just as a man of God, but as a friend of creation. He would speak to lambs as he passed them, call rabbits by name, and even thank worms for reminding him of humility. To him, nature was not separate from faith, it was woven into it. Years later, he would compose his famous hymn, the Canticle of the Creatures, where he called the sun his brother, the moon his sister, and even death his kind and holy sibling. Francis didn't just preach to animals, he preached with them. Because he understood, God speaks through everything he has made. We only need to be quiet and listen. Not far from Assisi, nestled in the green Umbrian hills, lay the town of Gubbio. It was a peaceful town, rich in faith and tradition. But one year, a terror spread through its streets. Not a war, not a plague, but a beast. A great wolf, fierce and ravenous, had descended from the surrounding woods. At first, it preyed on livestock, then on stray animals, and finally on people. It was said the wolf had no fear. It attacked shepherds in daylight, dragged children from farms, and waited at the city gates like a demon. Panic swept the town. Farmers stopped working their fields. Travelers stayed indoors. And though the townsmen tried to hunt the wolf, all failed. The beast was too strong, too clever. Soon, the town was paralyzed with fear. But when Francis heard of this from nearby villagers, his response wasn't alarm, it was compassion. He saw not just a monster, but a creature driven by hunger, fear, and isolation. A creature that, like every soul, longed for peace. So, despite warnings from his friends and the cries of the townspeople, Francis went out to find the wolf, alone. As he approached the forest's edge, the townspeople watched in horror. They expected to hear his screams within moments. But what they saw would become legend. From the shadows of the woods, the great wolf appeared, snarling, massive, its eyes wild and teeth bared. Francis did not run. He did not raise a weapon. He simply made the sign of the cross and spoke. "Brother Wolf," he said, "in the name of Christ, I order you to do no harm." The wolf stopped. It lowered its head. The growling ceased. And to the astonishment of all, it crept forward like a sheep and laid itself at Francis's feet. The saint knelt beside it and gently spoke again. "Brother Wolf, I know you are hungry. I know you have acted in fear. But your actions have brought terror to the people of this town. They fear you, and in their fear, they will kill you. But I believe there is another way. If you will make peace with them, I promise they will forgive you and feed you for the rest of your days." And then Francis offered his hand. The great wolf raised its paw and placed it in the saint's palm, as if to say, "Yes." Francis walked the wolf into the center of Gubbio. The people screamed and fled, but he called them back. "Do not be afraid," he said. "The wolf comes not as an enemy, but as a friend." In front of the townspeople, he explained the pact. The wolf would do no more harm, and in return, the people would feed and shelter him as one of their own. The people agreed, and from that day on, the wolf became part of the town. Children played near him. Women brought him scraps of bread. He lived among them gently until his death years later. When he died, the townspeople buried him with love, a symbol of peace, redemption, and the power of mercy. Francis had not slain the beast. He had understood him, and in doing so, he tamed not just the wolf, but the fear in human hearts. Because peace isn't forged by force, it is offered through love. As the years passed, Francis's reputation spread far and wide. People came from villages, cities, even other countries to hear him speak, not because he was powerful, but because he wasn't, because he was simple, because he was real, because he radiated something rare in the world, humble, holy joy. Wherever he walked, hearts softened, quarrels ceased. People fell to their knees, not before Francis, but before the love of God that shone through him. And with that purity came miracles. Quiet, unexpected, undeniable. There were stories of healings, of sick people who touched his robe and recovered, of the blind seeing again, of a paralyzed man who rose after Francis laid his hands upon him. There were times when he multiplied food for his brothers when they had nothing to eat, or when rain fell only after Francis prayed, ending droughts that plagued the countryside. But Francis never boasted of these moments. In fact, he often tried to hide them. He didn't want admiration. He wanted conversion. When people praised him, he would say, "What I am before God is what I am, and nothing more." His greatest miracle, many would say, was not healing the sick, but healing the prideful, the greedy, the angry. Through his gentleness, even the hardest hearts were softened. Despite his growing fame, Francis remained committed to a life of poverty and simplicity. He refused to own property. He scolded his brothers if they built houses that were too comfortable. He once refused to own a psalter, a simple prayer book, because it felt too luxurious. Even as the Franciscan order grew, he reminded them, a friar must have no more than a beggar, because Christ had no more than a beggar. He would stop and pick worms off paths to keep them from being crushed. He would give his cloak to strangers, even in the cold. He once told a brother to give away the gospel book if a poor man needed paper. To Francis, every detail of life, every moment, was an opportunity to surrender more fully to the love of God. He didn't seek comfort. He didn't seek success. He only sought to imitate Christ crucified, poor, humble, forgotten, and yet overflowing with divine love. And the world noticed. The order he founded, the Friars Minor, grew to thousands. His brothers traveled to every corner of Europe. Some even journeyed to Egypt to preach peace during the Crusades. But Francis, he remained the same, barefoot, joyful, sleeping under the stars, singing psalms, and talking with the birds. Because to him, holiness wasn't found in palaces or power, but in simplicity, obedience, and love. And those small daily choices, to love instead of hate, to serve instead of rule, to give instead of take, were the true miracles of his life. By the year 1224, Francis had become a living legend. Pilgrims traveled for days just to glimpse him. His brothers numbered in the thousands, and his name was whispered in reverence across Europe. But his body was beginning to fail. Years of fasting, walking barefoot in every season, sleeping in the cold, and embracing the sick had taken their toll. His eyes were nearly blind. His bones ached. His strength was fading, yet his spirit burned brighter than ever. He withdrew often to solitary places, caves, forests, mountaintops, to be alone with God. In one such place, on Mount La Verna, something sacred occurred. It was there, during a long retreat of fasting and prayer, that Francis had a vision of Christ crucified, blazing, radiant, and sorrowful. As he gazed upon the suffering Christ, his heart was overwhelmed with love and pain. He longed not only to follow Jesus, but to feel what Jesus felt, to be one with his suffering. When the vision ended, Francis looked down at his hands, and there, in the center of his palms, were wounds, bleeding, painful, in the exact places where Christ had been nailed to the cross. The same wounds appeared on his feet and in his side. He had received the stigmata, the first known in church history. The very marks of Christ's passion, imprinted not only on his soul, but on his body. It was a sacred mystery, one that Francis bore in silence, with humility. He hid the wounds for as long as he could, not out of fear, but to avoid praise. He said, "Love is not loved. Let me suffer, so I may love him better." As the months passed, his condition worsened. He grew weaker, more fragile, unable to walk without help. His brothers carried him to San Damiano, where Claire and her sisters cared for him tenderly. Eventually, they brought him back to the little hut near the chapel of Porziuncola, the place where his mission had truly begun. There, surrounded by his brothers, he prepared to meet Sister Death, not with dread, but with joy. He asked them to sing the Canticle of the Creatures, the song he had written in praise of the sun, moon, wind, fire, water, and death. Praised be you, my Lord, through Sister Death, from whom no living man can escape. He lay on the ground, naked, covered only by a simple cloth, the way he had entered the world and the way he chose to leave it. As his breathing grew faint, he whispered, "I have done what was mine to do. May Christ now teach you what is yours." On October 3rd, 1226, as the sun set and the birds sang their final evening hymn, Francis of Assisi passed into eternity, singing, smiling, completely surrendered. He was just 44 years old. 2 years later, the church declared him a saint. But Francis didn't need a title to be holy. He had already become what God had always intended, a little poor man who loved deeply, lived freely, and died in the embrace of his Creator. Though his earthly life ended in silence and song, the legacy of Francis of Assisi only grew louder with time, not in noise, but in impact. He left behind no wealth, no palace, no throne. He held no office, wrote no political manifesto. Yet his life continues to echo through centuries, shaping not just churches, but the very conscience of the world. His followers, the Order of Friars Minor, grew rapidly. By the time of his canonization, the Franciscan family included thousands of men and women, friars, nuns, and laypeople who had been inspired by his radical simplicity, his love of the poor, and his devotion to Christ. His closest spiritual companion, Saint Clare of Assisi, had founded the Poor Clares, a contemplative order of women who embraced poverty and prayer. Together, they became a new kind of Christian witness, one not bound by walls or rituals, but by love and lived gospel. Francis's teachings, though never written in grand theological works, were preserved in his writings, letters, and above all, his life. He taught not from a pulpit, but from the road, not with theory, but with tears. Preached the gospel at all times. He is often quoted as saying, "When necessary, use words." He taught that joy was possible even in suffering, that peace was stronger than war, that creation itself was not to be used, but cherished, because it was made by love. This vision made him not only beloved within the church, but admired across religions, cultures, and generations. Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, atheists, many have found in Francis a figure of universal compassion. He is one of the few saints honored outside of Christian circles. And in modern times, his influence has only grown stronger. When Pope John Paul II declared Francis the patron saint of ecology in 1979, it was a formal recognition of something the earth itself already knew. Francis had been its most faithful steward. He saw the world not as property, but as family, the sun as brother, the moon as sister, the earth as mother, and all creatures as companions on the journey to God. In 2013, the newly elected pope chose the name Francis, the first time in papal history, to honor the man who loved the poor and followed Christ with reckless abandon. Even today, statues of Saint Francis adorn gardens and parks. His prayer, "Lord, make me an instrument of your peace," is recited by millions across continents. But his legacy is not meant to rest in stone or ceremony. It lives on in you and in me. When we forgive, when we serve, when we walk gently upon this earth, when we love without seeking anything in return. Francis didn't want to be admired. He wanted to be imitated, not in sandals or tunics, but in spirit, in surrender, in a life that points not to itself, but to God. And that is his greatest legacy, a mirror held up to Christ, so that the world might see his reflection in the eyes of a man who gave up everything and found everything. Centuries have passed since Saint Francis walked the dusty roads of Assisi. The world has changed, cities have risen, empires have fallen, technologies have advanced, and the noise of modern life grows louder with each passing day. And yet, in the silence between all that noise, his voice still whispers, not through grand sermons or long debates, but through the soft rustle of leaves, the quiet chirping of birds, the eyes of the poor, the ache of the forgotten, and the still small voice that asks each of us, "Can you love like this?" Why does Francis still matter? Because he touches something eternal. He reminds us that holiness is not about perfection, it's about surrender. That joy doesn't come from abundance, it comes from detachment. That love isn't measured by sentiment, but by sacrifice. In an age where we seek more money, more recognition, more control, Francis calls us back to less. Less noise, less ego, less self. And in doing so, we discover what we've truly been hungry for all along: peace, freedom, God. He challenges every comfort we cling to and every fear we hide behind. He walks barefoot into our modern world and asks gently, "What are you still holding on to?" He shows us that you can live with nothing and yet possess everything. That you can lose the whole world and still rejoice like the sparrows. That you can kiss a leper, bless a wolf, weep at a cross, and sing as you die, and somehow call it joy. The world doesn't need another influencer, another expert, another king. It needs more Francises, people who walk humbly, love deeply, give quietly, and see God in the ordinary. His spirit lives on in animal shelters and homeless missions, in gardens planted with care, in homes that welcome strangers, in hearts that forgive what others say is unforgivable, in voices that choose gentleness over rage. He still walks beside those who weep, who doubt, who long for a simple and holy life in a complicated and unholy age. He is the saint of nature, but more than that, he is the saint of reverence, the one who saw everything and everyone as sacred. And so, as long as there is a bird in the sky, a beggar on the street, or a soul yearning to be free, Saint Francis of Assisi will continue to speak. Dear soul listening today, this isn't just a story about a saint from long ago. It's a mirror held up to our lives, a quiet invitation from heaven. What would happen if you let go of everything the world told you to chase and followed me instead? Saint Francis was not born holy. He was restless, proud, ambitious, just like so many of us. He didn't hear angels singing at birth. He heard Christ whispering in ruins, saying, "Rebuild my church." And so he did, not with stone and wood alone, but with mercy, with tears, with tenderness, with a life that preached louder than words ever could. Francis teaches us that holiness isn't about escaping the world. It's about loving it more deeply, more truthfully, more like Christ. He shows us that we don't need power to change the world. We need purity. We need humility. We need the courage to kneel. You don't have to be famous to be faithful. You don't need riches to live richly. You don't need a cathedral to worship, just a heart willing to be broken and rebuilt. So today, ask yourself, where is God asking you to rebuild? Who is the leper in your life you've avoided? What wolf are you called to make peace with? What are you clinging to that Christ is asking you to lay down? And perhaps most of all, can you see God in the birds, the trees, the poor, the forgotten, even in yourself? Let the life of Saint Francis inspire you to live with less and love with more, to choose simplicity, to walk lightly on the earth, to give freely, forgive quickly, and sing joyfully, even in suffering. Let us close with his prayer. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. May you walk today with the courage of Francis, the humility of Christ, and the joy of heaven. Peace and all good. Amen.